If we're all in place, we will start the evening. A couple of minor announcements. One is that for those of you who didn't know, you should thank Betty Allen for the wine tonight. And Betty, you're right, it was better than the normal DePauw quality. Jason alluded to something earlier on, and you should be prepared for it to happen many times this weekend. He said we had overflowed this place for dinner tonight, and there also is a record, as he said, for the Wednesday night activities, and you're going to hear that record thing many times this weekend. Our speaker tonight has written over 30 novels. Many of you know them very well, and hopefully your grandchildren may know them also, your older grandchildren. In 1999, he won the silver medal in the Newbery competition for A Long Way from Chicago. Then in 2001, he was awarded the Newbery highest medal for A Year Down Yonder. In 2002, he received a National Humanities Medal presented to him by the President and Mrs. Bush. Later, he had the honor to be included in the famous Mrs. Bush's list, Laura's list, as one of the top 57 children's books that were favorites of hers. In 2002, Dick Moscow? 2005, he represented Mrs. Bush at the Moscow International Book Festival, and later this year, he will present at the National Book Festival in Washington and have dinner at the White House again. His most recent book is Here Lies the Librarian, which sounds like a murder mystery to me. It is my privilege to introduce my friend and our class keynote speaker, Richard to the world, Dick to us, Dick Peck.
Ladies and gentlemen, classmates, for all we know, this may only be a dream. We come and go like the ripples on a stream. Ned Lamkin's collegians sang that to us over and over back at the other end of life, when we danced across unair-conditioned evenings through the French doors of a new Union building out onto the terrace beneath a Hoosier moon. I'm not done. A throbbing mass of ROTC haircuts and Palm Beach dinner jackets, of wrist corsages and Playtex girdles. Back when music was for loving someone else and not yourself. For all we know, the collegians sang, "Tomorrow may never come," but it has, and we are here, the class of 1956. Back on ground hallowed by nostalgia after a 50-year interruption of real life. Back where we began together, when all the world was young and love would conquer all. We have many secrets from each other, but age is not one of them. And so we savor these first precious moments together, this happy hiatus, before the pictures of the grandchildren start coming out. As we begin to recall and relive that handful of years we shared, those moonlight serenades, that autumn foliage, that Gothic bell tower against a dark blue sky, a tiger's growl, a silent owl, when we were young together. In those 4 fleeting, sun-struck years between Hell Week and the honeymoon. History repeats as we have lived to learn, and we return exactly 50 years after graduation week. And for perspective, historically, the class returning for its 50th reunion that year had graduated 6 weeks after the San Francisco earthquake. How proud I am to have this first word, but I am not, as you know, the official class speaker, though we are in his presence. A poor representative I would make. I who couldn't be an econ major because of the math. Or pre-med because of the chemistry. Or pre-theo because of that little fault line of impiety running through me. And I couldn't have gone near law school because anybody could have talked me out of anything. I had to become a writer, and so I am. And being a writer is like being a greeter at Walmart. You never have to retire, but there are no benefits. Yes, and you have pensions. To be a writer was the first dream of my life, and it came true because of the heritage we all share of coming of age in a world still run by adults, in homes where no screens glowed, of grade schools in which Ritalin was not regarded as a teaching tool, of junior highs that did not encourage puberty, in high schools where literacy was not an elective, whole school systems that feared no parent. In a time when no child was left behind because no child would have dared to be. It was a golden age in a world made safer by diagrammed sentences. And then we went to college. And it didn't take a moving van to get us here. We came to a university built on a foundation as firm as Indiana limestone in the humanities. This university, where multiculturalism meant 2 years, 16 credits of a foreign language. And Dr. Gruninger flinging a handful of us out into the great world of European universities for junior year. And it was real foreign study. We couldn't take our peer groups with us. There were giants in those times, Raymond W. Pence, from whom more generations than ours learned the two truths. Nothing is real until it is written down. And if you cannot use language, it will be used against you. Since chronology is kind, Dr. Pence did not live to hear what our children and our grandchildren did to deconstruct the American English language. You know. Because in the absence of adult authority, the young dare never be better spoken than their peer group leaders. The young speak only the language of power and are deaf to all else. We were the last generation to receive a liberal arts education, because a liberal arts education is not a salad bar of politically convenient electives. It is a sweep through sequential history and how it repeats, the history of everything. And we had Professor George Bourne Manhart, and Herodotus of our own, driving us like cattle across Western civilization. Professor Manhart, who retired the day we graduated, having joined this faculty in 1919. Had he exchanged World War I khaki for his academic robes? We don't know. We were too young to ask. But we were a post-war generation too, a post-war Cold War generation. Half of us allowed on this campus only at the conditional pleasure of our local draft boards. The greatest incentive to academic endeavor ever devised. Higher education has never recovered from President Nixon's abolishing of the draft. Then war broke out on this very campus, regularly, once a year, as Dr. Andrew Crandall cut and thrust across the battlefield at Gettysburg, sweeping us over the great divide that cut a nation in two. Dr. Crandall, whose wife, Marion Bradford Crandall, was once heard to remark that she had lost her husband in the Civil War. There was Professor Virginia Harlow, who could have played Lady Bracknell in The Importance of Being Earnest. There was Dean Jerome Hickson, who appeared to have fallen out of a Noel Coward play and landed fully costumed in Putnam County. There was Professor Reed Winsey, a one-man Montparnasse, strolling the boulevards of Greencastle. There was Professor Harry Hawkins of the psychology department, a psychological study in himself. There was Professor Van Denman Thompson, who had joined the faculty in 1911, a tiny giant who could fill the universe with music. They were the last of their line, the last of the wine, and we were there at their feet. They became our lifelong luggage. We took them wherever we went. They are with us this evening. We seat them among us within the range of memory. Because education is never what you want to know. Education is what you're going to need to know. Education isn't information retrieval. Education is recognizing the past when it comes around again. This faculty sent me to New York to be a writer. Most people have to be something else on their ways to writing careers, and I had to be, after being a soldier, a teacher, an English teacher, of course. What else is there? Because if you cannot read appreciatively and write coherently and speak persuasively and listen skeptically, you will find a way to fail at whatever you want. I was a teacher as long as I could be. I might have been a teacher unto the end had I been allowed to teach as I was taught. But when teachers are more tired at the end of the school day than the students, the wrong people are being educated. But it was as a teacher I found my next career. I found the people I most wanted to write for. I found them in my roll book. They were my students. And from our first mornings together, I knew things about them their parents dared never know. They were the baby boomers heading for the barricades in what was to become the second great American Revolution. The revolution that ran the Latin teacher out of town, pursued by an angry anti-intellectual mob composed of lazy children, ignorant parents, and school administrators who had risen once too often from the social studies department. The revolution that laid waste and set on fire any number of campuses, including this one. And some of what was burned could not be rebuilt. My first students weren't a lot younger than we, but they were coming of age on some other planet. They were suburban. And so they believed they were gifted because their parents had paid so much for the house. They were growing up in places without geography or history or sidewalks. Communities zoned against old people. There were no old people in their lives, sitting on front porches, monitoring the street, spinning yarns, passing the story down, recalling how much better the old days were. The revolutions of the late 60s and 70s sent me off in another direction to find a way to communicate with the young and to offer them on the page, if I could, some sense of that community we took for granted with the stories our elders told. So here is a story I have written about being young long ago, even before our time, a yarn our grandparents might have spun about a one-room schoolhouse. And I have written it for people who cannot remember the 20th century. The story is called, By Far the Worst Pupil at Long Point School. When we were kids, we always ate our Christmas dinner at Grandma and Grandpa's. They lived in that little frame house back in the fields past Long Point School. Of course, house and school are long vanished now, gone to wherever memories go. Grandma could do some cooking once she got that old black iron stove fired up. Come Christmas Day, every chair around her table was filled. Uncle Billy never missed. Being a bachelor, he made the rounds of other people's tables for all his holiday meals and most Sunday dinners. He can smell a turkey roasting from the other end of the county, Grandma said. Some people welcomed Uncle Billy for the stories he told. Other people put up with him. Grandma put up with him. She was his big sister, though a quarter his size. Since Uncle Billy had never married or left the district, nothing had happened to him as a grown-up. All his stories were about the days of yore when he was a boy. Trying to picture Uncle Billy and Grandma and Grandpa as young was more than I could manage. They all three looked like they'd been whittled out of used lumber. Uncle Billy was full of stories, but some of us grandkids had never heard Grandpa speak. Certain people claimed the last words Grandpa ever uttered were at his wedding to Grandma. When he said, "I do." "Who wants more oyster dressing?" Grandma said. "I do," said Uncle Billy, which made us all look at Grandpa. "Who besides Billy?" said Grandma from the kitchen door. After the turkey and trimmings came the pies and the suet pudding with hard sauce and then a bowl of fruit nobody ever touched. Only then did Uncle Billy ease back from the table. When he undid the top button on his pants and the last button on his vest, we knew we were in for a story. He said all his stories were to benefit us young ones. He put them together like quilts, with scenes from earlier tales stitched into new patterns. "Oh, you talk about strict. You don't know what strict is, without my sister for your teacher." He glanced at Grandma, who said, "It wasn't any picnic for me either, and at $8 a month." We'd heard about how Grandma had been the teacher at Long Point School when she was still just a teenage girl herself. I just put my toe over the line a very little bit and she'd come down on me like the wolf on the fold. "You couldn't help being a slow thinker, Billy," Grandma said, "but the least you could do was behave." She liked to wear me out with that paddle. It hung on the wall right there within her reach. Oh, she was quick with that paddle. I couldn't sit all the way down without pain till I was right at 30 years of age. "I thought it'd take you that long to get through 8th grade, Grandma said. She'd even whoop a girl if that girl got sassy with her. She whooped Gladys Birdwell. Grandma never really reminisced, but now she nodded. I have an idea there's still marks on Gladys that don't show in daylight. She'd paddle a boy half again her size, Uncle Billy recalled, but of course it didn't work with Charlie. Nothing fazed Charlie. He was by far the worst pupil at Long Point School. Grandma sat with us now around the remains of Christmas dinner. "No," she admitted, "the paddle didn't work on Charlie. We had his 2 privies," Uncle Billy said, "one for the boys, one for the girls." We young ones watched the buttons on his straining vest. After such a meal, if one of those buttons popped off, it could put your eye out. And Charlie was sweet on some girl. Was it Gladys Birdwell? It was Estelle Grubb, Grandma said. Anyway, Charlie's notion of getting a girl's attention was to steal her stocking cap and throw it down the girl's privy. Just the idea of a boy going into the girl's privy was enough to call out the National Guard at that time. But did that faze Charlie? No. This was at recess, and somebody run to tell teacher on him. "It was you, Billy," Grandma said. "And that sister of mine bust out of Long Point School like she was being shot from a cannon. Her boots never touched gravel as she rounded the building, and in her hand a padlock and a—" "No, Billy. You got 2 different stories mixed up in your head," Grandma said. "As usual." "This isn't the padlock story," Grandma said. "This is the fishing pole story. When Charlie threw Estelle's stocking cap down the privy, I made him take a bamboo pole and a hook and a line and go fishing for it down the privy hole. Took him nearly till dark to snag that stocking cap. Did it faze Charlie? One of us grandkids asked. Not much, Grandma said. Even when I made him wear the cap. The padlock story took place the following year when Charlie was repeating 8th grade. That's right, Uncle Billy said, hoping to tell it. We always locked both them privies every night. The padlocks themselves rested in teacher's desk. Well, sir, one day at recess, Charlie not only went back into the girls' privy, but he was smoking in there. You could see the smoke curling out of the half moon cut in the privy door. And naturally, no girl could use it. Somebody run to tell teacher on it. It was you, Billy, Grandma said. And that sister of mine bust out of Long Point School like she was being shot from a cannon. Her boots never touched gravel as she rounded the building. And in her hand a padlock and a claw hammer and a chunk of wood, and in her mouth 2 10-penny nails. She drew up short at the girls' privy and snapped the padlock on the latch. That locked him in right there. Then she put that chunk of wood up against the half moon, cut in the door, and drove the nails in to keep it in place. She meant to smoke that boy like a turkey. She was quick, so I have an idea Charlie didn't grasp what had happened. Anyway, when he tried the door, he seen he was in jail. By then, teacher was ringing the bell to call us back from recess, but it was hard to concentrate on our lessons the rest of that morning. Concentration never came easy for you, Billy, Grandma said. The sounds coming from the girls' privy would have waked up the dead. Uncle Billy remembered. Charlie was like a bull kicking in a pen. It was cold weather, so he had on boots, and he commenced kicking all 4 sides. It took him to noon, but he knocked that privy down. Finally, it was just Charlie standing out there on bald ground, breathing hard. The privy door was flat before him, and the landscape littered with pages from the Sears catalog, fluttering like moths. And there is but very little justice in this world, Grandma said. The school board took the cost of that privy out of my wages. They said I'd overstepped my bounds, that I was hired to educate my pupils, not to cure them like hams. But did it faze Charlie? Us grandkids asked. Not in the least, Grandma said. There was only one thing left to be done, Uncle Billy said. And I did it, Grandma said. What? We grandkids wondered. I married him. Grandma peered down the table at Grandpa. Remember that, Charlie? I do, Grandpa said. That story appears in a collection of my short stories that has a title that better expresses me than it expresses the book. It's called Past Perfect, Present Tense. In most of my short stories, in all of my novels, there's an old person. And the older I get, the stronger that character becomes. He or she is there to embody and bootleg some history to a generation who is learning no history at school. To remind the permissively reared that there was life before their time. An elderly character to link the generation and to provide family, because a family is only as strong as its stories. And it's just possible that my readers do not have to write thank you notes for gifts from grandparents. And so they rob themselves of their roots and are once again at the mercy of each other. One story leads to the next, and you keep writing. And there is a government agency to help you with writer's block. It's called the IRS. And so the short story you've just heard became the stem cell for a novel, as will often happen. A novel set back home again in Indiana, and written in the rhythms of the great Hoosier poet, James Whitcomb Riley. A novel set over there in fictitious fields in Park County, somewhere between Rockville and Montezuma. And since my favorite readers are young, my whole career hangs upon the opening line. You are only as good as your opening line, because if your readers do not like the first line, they'll never see the second. Grade school does nothing for the attention span now, and neither does instant messaging. And so my whole career is the search for a perfect opening line. Is there a perfect opening line? Actually, there is, and I found it. And this is an opening line that won me a standing ovation from sixth graders. I share it with you now. If your teacher has to die, August isn't a bad time of year for it. That went over so big with the puberty people, you can't believe it. Shall we read on? Yes. You know August. The corn's earing. The tomatoes are ripening on the vine. There's a little less evening now, and that's a warning. You want to live every day twice over because you will be back in the jailhouse of school by the end of the month. Then our teacher, Miss Mert Arbuckle, hauled off and died. It was like a miracle. Though she must have been 40. You should have seen my kid brother's face. It looked like Lloyd was hearing the music of the spheres. You couldn't deny Miss Mert Arbuckle was past her prime. She was hard of hearing in one ear, no doubt deafened by her own screaming. And she couldn't whup us like she wanted to. She was a southpaw for whupping, and she had arthritis in that elbow. So while she could still whup, it didn't make much of an impression. So when you get right down to it, if you can't hear and you can't whup, you're better off dead than teaching. At least that's how I saw it. There was always talk about shutting down Hominy Ridge School anyway. Now me and Lloyd saw its end might be nigh, and hope broke over us. It was surely too late to find another teacher who'd teach in a school like this. Hominy Ridge was nothing but an out-of-date, unimproved, one-room country schoolhouse. They admitted it didn't pay to keep it for just a straggle of kids who went there. Dad was on the school board. Me and Lloyd hoped to encourage him to close down the school and drive all formal education out of this part of Park County. For one thing, I'd been 15 for half a year and still hadn't passed the 8th grade graduation exam. Besides, I had me a dream, and school only stood in its way. Russell, will they have a funeral for her? Lloyd's mind whirled, and he looked up at me, perplexed. Well, of course they'll have a funeral for her, I said. Did you think they'd just feed her to the hogs? But I knew how Lloyd thought. Regular people have funerals, but Miss Mert was a teacher. As for a funeral, it was hot weather, and the crops were in the ground, and the roads were dry, and the fair was over. What else do people have to do? I said. They'll all turn out for Miss Mert. They better, Lloyd said darkly. She's liable to set up in that coffin and take roll. And so it begins, and it's called The Teacher's Funeral. You will notice in the story that Russell has a dream, and school is standing in his way. Without giving away too much, I'll tell you what that dream is. He plans to quit school that fall, run off, and bring in the wheat harvest up in the Dakotas. It was a rite of passage in those days. Men and boys from around the continent converged upon the Dakotas to bring in the wheat in that steam-driven era. It's Russell's dream of escape, and it was my own father's dream of escape, too. And he left 7th grade to pursue it. He hopped a freight to the Chicago yards and another freight to Fargo, and he never came back to school. And so 97 years later, I have rewritten his history, and I have given him someone who keeps him at home to get the education he never had. That's what a novel is, not what was, but what ought to have been. And that's who a novelist is, one who believes history can always be improved upon. And besides, this is a story about my dad, and nobody a writer ever loved is dead. And now we're back home again in Indiana. And as we have noticed, our lives are of the lengths of novels. You could hardly call us haikus. We are the most enigmatic, mysterious, under-the-radar generation of a century. We were the overlooked younger siblings of the great generation, the World War II people. How much we heard about the veterans who had just cleared this campus when we arrived in 1952. How much we heard about their maturity of judgment from our professors, even our house mothers. They had passed the test before they got here. Then in hardly more than a decade, A generation younger than we was saying, don't trust anybody over 30. And they meant us. And yet we were to prove to be the most trustworthy people they ever met, including their own children. And when those baby boomers turned 60, they made the cover of Newsweek. When we turned 60, you could have heard a pin drop. We were born in the darkest days of the Great Depression, we and the Dion quintuplets, in the era of brother, can you spare a dime? And we marched into kindergarten on the day Hitler marched into Poland. The theme of our grade school years was war, the most popular theme of the young, us against them, and on a global scale. A red, white, and blue childhood of saving stamps and ration books and scrap drives and meatless Tuesdays and blackouts and brownouts and loose lips sink ships and more geography than anybody was ever to learn after us. And our 1950s coming of age was to be a near endless series of hurdles to clear before we were allowed on the very bottom rung of adult life. An obstacle course of overlapping applications and uninflated grades and deferments and interviews and tryouts and dues to pay, a sort of eternal rush week with the promise of rejection at every hand, by day and by night. No one before us, no one after us had so many rules to follow. Was it purely by chance that the #1 Hollywood box office movie of our senior year was called The 10 Commandments? 11 wouldn't have surprised us. Being a novelist is the eternal attempt to give life a shape. And now we see the shape of ours. Between December 7th, 1941 and September 11th, 2001, there was a Pearl Harbor at either end of our lives. One of those attacks on 9/11 came out of a clear blue sky on a heartbreakingly beautiful late summer morning upon the city where I live. There followed an awful night of feeling useless and helpless and suddenly old. One of those nights when you have to write a poem just to get through till morning. I called the poem September 11th. We thought we'd outdistanced history, told our children it was nowhere near. Even when history struck Columbine, didn't happen here. We took down the maps in the classroom, and when they were safely furled, we told the young what they wanted to hear, that they were immune from a menacing world. But history isn't a folded up map or an unread textbook tome. Now we know history's a fireman's child waiting at home alone. The thunder of the real world recedes, and now we are back to the place that gave us our starts, all those hurdles ago, together again to let the noisy world and years slip away until we can begin to hear the old songs again. When you walk through a storm, hold your head up high. Ring, ching, ching. Ring, ching, ching. Pi beta phi. Oh, it's a long, long time from May to December, but we have these moments to remember. Long ago and far away, to old DePauw, we toast today.